Bryan Kohberger, the defendant in the Idaho 4 case that saw the lives of Kaylee Goncalves, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, and Madison Mogen destroyed, and his lawyers are back in court trying to get evidence thrown out so that it cannot be introduced during his trial. Say hello to my office assistant. This is Zoe. Hey, Zoe. One key piece of evidence that the defense wants thrown out is the DNA evidence. Let's talk about it. The defense is saying that genetic information was illegally gathered by law enforcement, and they're citing the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The authorities have said Kohberger's DNA was on a K-bar sheath found below Madison Mogen's body. That touch DNA was later matched to Bryan Kohberger through a cheek or what's called a buccal swab. Now, the DNA isn't the only evidence that the defense is challenging, but it's what I'm going to talk about today. Hi, I'm T, and this is Bed Crime Stories. If you enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And now, without further ado, let's dig in. Prosecutors have until December 6th to respond to the defense's filings, and a public hearing is scheduled for January 23rd. If the DNA evidence does end up getting suppressed, it's going to greatly weaken the prosecution's case. However, as we saw in the Delphi case, DNA doesn't always have to be present at the crime scene for a defendant to be convicted. Curious about touch DNA, which is what was found on that leather sheath in Moscow, Idaho, I did a little research. Take a listen to this fascinating case that proves that touch DNA cannot always be trusted. I found a fascinating case in which touch DNA took a homeless man through a wild and disturbing ride through the justice system. The Marshall Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit news organization dedicated to reforming the criminal justice system. It was on their website that I stumbled on an article about a man who was framed for what I'm going to call red rum by his own DNA. A lot of people are not convinced that Bryan Kohberger is the perpetrator, or at least the sole perpetrator, of the crime in Moscow, Idaho. And one thing they continually cite is that touch DNA that was found on the leather sheath. So here's a real-life story about touch DNA that will blow your mind. Back on November 29th of 2012, a brutal crime took place in Monte Sereno, California. Around midnight, a group of men decide to break into a 7,000 square foot mansion. The intruders find the man of the house, Ravish Kumra, in the living room watching CNN. How many of you can relate to that? Sitting in front of the TV, CNN is playing, maybe you fall asleep in your comfortable chair. Here's the part I hope you have never experienced. All of a sudden, Ravish is awakened by the sound of intruders. It's two men that he's never seen before. They blindfold him and they tie his hands behind his back. They also put a piece of print duct tape over his mouth. The duct tape has the print of a mustache on it, some sort of sick joke. The men then head upstairs where they find Ravish's companion, Harinder, asleep in a bedroom. The men hit her on the mouth and tie her up next to Ravish. For whatever reason, they don't put the duct tape over Harinder's mouth. As Ravish and Harinder sit helpless, the thieves search the house for cash and jewelry. After they leave, Harinder finds her way to the kitchen phone and dials 911. The police and paramedics soon arrive. One of the paramedics declares Ravish dead. It turns out the mustache duct tape had made it impossible to breathe. 3.5 weeks after the crime, DNA results from the crime scene come back. Soon an arrest is made. The suspect is 26-year-old Lucas Anderson. Anderson is a homeless alcoholic with a lengthy rap sheet, and he's known to have blackouts when he drinks to excess. When the police arrest him, Anderson tells them he has no memory of such a crime, but because of his blackouts, Anderson says, "Maybe I did it." His public defender shushes him, but the evidence is pretty damning on paper. Anderson's DNA has been found on Ravish's fingernails. The police say they believe Ravish struggled as Anderson tied him up. Because of the DNA match, Anderson is charged with red rum. But all the while, he's insistent that he has no memory of the crime, and it's not the type of criminal behavior he has committed in the past. Anderson was more of a hustler than an unaliver. Months went by, and still Anderson sat in jail feeling hopeless. The cops were 100% certain they had the right guy. I mean, how could Lucas's DNA end up on a dead man that he swore he never met? Now, back in the 1980s, when DNA forensic analysis was a new concept, crime labs needed bodily fluid, usually blood, sometimes stuff that comes out of wee-wees, I don't know how to say that, or spit, to generate a genetic profile. Fast forward to 1997 and everything changed. An Australian forensic scientist named Roland van Oorschot shocked the criminal justice system with a white paper he wrote titled DNA Fingerprints from Fingerprints. The paper revealed that DNA can be detected not just from bodily fluids, but also from traces left by a touch, by a fingerprint. This is when investigators began looking at crime scenes for anything that might have been touched by the perpetrator. Things like doorknobs, countertops, and yes, even leather sheaths housing sharp-edged objects. Oorschot's lab was investigating something called secondary transfer, which is when one person touches something, let's say a stair railing in a mall, and then another person comes along, touches the railing at the mall, and then commits a crime where he or she leaves DNA on something, and it turns out to be the DNA that he or she picked up from the stair railing. So the DNA gets traced back to the original person who touched the stair railing. Now, according to experts, we all leave a trail of our DNA everywhere we go. An average person can shed upwards of 50 million skin cells a day. It's been calculated that in 2 minutes, the average person sheds enough skin cells to cover a football field. Is this why my house is still dusty after I clean it, like right after I dust? We also spew out saliva and sneezes, sending our DNA out into the atmosphere. It's frightening to learn that our DNA can make its way to a crime scene that we were never at. Today, labs can identify people with DNA from just a handful of cells, and just a few cells can easily get away from us and migrate. So unfortunately, the DNA of someone other than the perpetrator can turn up at a crime scene, and somehow, for Lucas Anderson, his DNA had found its way onto the nails of an unalived man, Ravish Kumar. When DNA from Ravish and Harinder was tested, a handful of unknown profiles turned up. Those profiles were run through a state database of people arrested or convicted of felonies. There were 3 hits. One belonged to 22-year-old DeAngelo Austin. His DNA was found on the duct tape used to silence Ravish. 2. 21-year-old Javier Garcia's DNA was found on gloves. 3. 26-year-old Lucas Anderson's DNA was on Ravish's fingernail clippings. Right about now, I can hear you guys saying, T, enough with the fingernail clippings. They're so gross. I'm gonna try not to show them again, okay? Within weeks, the police had a lot of evidence implicating Austin and Garcia. A warrant for their cell phone records showed that they'd pinged on towers near Ravish and Harinder's mansion on the night of the crime. It also turned out that Austin belonged to a gang linked to a series of burglaries. Also, Austin's sister, 32-year-old Katrina Fritz, an escort, had been, get this, involved with Ravish for 12 years. So she had spent time, shall we say, with the victim, Ravish, over a 12-year period. That's a link between the victim and Austin. Police even found Katrina's phone number backed up on Ravish's computer. She eventually admitted that she'd given her brother a map of Ravish's mansion. Connecting Lucas Anderson to the crime proved much harder. There were no phone records showing that he'd traveled to Monte Sereno that night, and he wasn't associated with any gang. Anderson did, however, have one felony residential burglary on his rap sheet. Eventually, though, detectives did find a link. 1 year before the crime, Anderson had been locked up in the same jail as a friend of Austin's. It was a guy named Sean Hampton. Hampton wore an ankle monitor as a condition of his parole. That monitor showed that 2 days before the crime, Hampton had driven to San Jose. He made a couple of stops downtown, right near where the homeless man, Lucas Anderson, hung out. Detectives realized that when Austin was planning the break-in at Ravish's house, he likely wanted a local guy experienced in burglary. So Hampton maybe hooked Austin up with his former jailmate, Lucas Anderson. So that was the cops' theory. Detectives then go back to Anderson. They show him pictures of Ravish and Harinder. Anderson says, I don't know them. Then the detectives pull out a photo of Lucas's mother, and they ask him, all right, what about this lady here? You don't know who she is? Anderson remains silent. That's kind of a mean thing to do to somebody that you don't know for sure is guilty of something. Doesn't that sound like something the Godfather would do? Show a picture of a loved one and say, if you don't talk, we are going to hurt this person. Next, the detective puts a letter in front of Lucas showing the DNA match between his DNA and the profile of the person found on Ravish's fingernails. Anderson, however, keeps saying over and over, he doesn't know anything about the crime. When detectives dig a little deeper into Anderson, they see that on November 29th, the night of the crime, Lucas Anderson was actually in the hospital. He'd arrived in an ambulance at the Valley Medical Center where he was declared inebriated, nearly to the point of unconsciousness. Thus, it was impossible for Lucas to have been at the crime scene. To make sure they weren't missing anything, the detectives retraced all of Lucas's movements that day, and they were able to see that a 7-Eleven clerk called the cops at 7:54 p.m. complaining that Lucas was panhandling. He moved on before the cops arrived. Then he walked 4 blocks east to the S&S Market, where a clerk saw him sit down in front of the shop at around 8:15 p.m. He was clearly drunk. A couple of hours later, he wandered into the store and collapsed. The clerk dialed 911, and soon the police and a fire truck arrived. They put Anderson on a stretcher and took him to the hospital, and he was admitted at around 10:54 p.m. The doctor who treated Anderson said that he remained in a hospital bed all night long. And remember, he was pretty much blackout drunk and unconscious. Harinder had said that the men who unalived Ravish rampaged through their house between 11:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m., 2 hours. So how did Anderson's DNA end up on Ravish's nails if he was lying in a hospital bed and clearly wasn't at the crime scene? The detectives were baffled, but they continued poring over Anderson's medical records. They paused on the names of ambulance paramedics who picked Anderson up from the SNS market. Something about those names seemed familiar, so they pull out the file on Ravish's death. The paramedics' names were there. It turned out that 3 hours after picking Anderson up at the SNS market, those same paramedics had responded to Ravish and Harinder's mansion. Once there, they checked Ravish's vital signs. It was looking as if the paramedics inadvertently moved Lucas Anderson's DNA from him onto Ravish's fingernails. The paramedics likely used the same pulse oximeter on both patients' fingers. It's also possible Anderson's DNA was somehow on the paramedics' uniforms. Remember, an average person sheds up to 50 million skin cells a day, which does make it very strange when a perpetrator's DNA is not found at the crime scene. In the end, Anderson was exonerated, and the deputy district attorney described how this freak DNA accident occurred. He described it as, "It's a small world." So, will Bryan Kohberger's attorney succeed in getting the DNA evidence from the leather sheath thrown out? I'm going to guess that they won't succeed, but again, I believe their argument has more to do with the police possibly violating people's privacy rights when they entered the touch DNA from the snap of the leather sheath into public genealogy databases. We'll have to keep an eye out and see what happens, and I will see you next time on Bed Crime Stories.